Okay, so you want to conquer the largest land empire in human history. You picture the horseback charges, the cities that surrendered before a single arrow flew, a name that traveled faster than the army carrying it. You think about the battles, the tribute, the gold pouring in from every direction. Very few people think about the payroll. Here is the number that puts all of it in perspective. By the early 1300s, the government running the richest piece of that empire, China, under the Great Khans, was spending nearly double what it collected in taxes, covering the gap with a currency it could print, but could no longer back with silver. That is not a footnote. That is the whole story compressed into one number. So here is the question nobody asks cleanly. How does the most feared military machine in history get brought down, not by a rival army, but by its own accounting? The answer is not what most people expect, and once you understand it, you will see the Mongol Empire in a completely different light. It starts with a toll booth. Actually, thousands of them. But before we can understand how an empire built on conquest nearly bankrupted itself, we need to understand the broken trade system it replaced. Before we understand the Mongol economy, we need to understand the mess it grew out of. In the late 12th century, the Silk Road connecting China to the Mediterranean was less a highway than an obstacle course. Every petty kingdom, every warlord, every local governor between Beijing and Baghdad had the right to charge a toll, confiscate goods, or simply rob a caravan outright. A merchant moving silk from northern China toward Persia might cross a dozen jurisdictions along the way, each with its own tax, its own currency, its own armed men waiting at the border. Long-distance trade wasn't just dangerous, it was economically irrational. The accumulated tolls alone could eat a caravan's entire profit margin before it ever reached its destination. Genghis Khan was born into a fractured steppe world, where tribes raided each other for horses and status, rather than traded, and he understood something the settled empires around him didn't. The toll booths were the real obstacle, and removing them was worth more than any single conquest. After unifying the Mongol and Turkic tribes under his authority at a great assembly, or Kuriltai, in 1206, he didn't just build an army, he built a jurisdiction, one continuous legal space in which a single passport, the paisa, could move a person or a shipment of goods thousands of miles without a second toll ever being charged. Merchants received tax exemptions. Caravans received armed protection. Trade routes that had been carved up by 100 competing tax collectors were suddenly operating under one set of rules. The early evidence that this worked arrived fast. Within a few decades, foreign merchants, Uyghurs, Persians, Central Asians, eventually Venetians like the Polo family, were flooding into Mongol territory to take advantage of the new terms. The Mongols formalized this with trading partnerships called ortak, in which Mongol nobility, and often the noble women who managed a family's commercial affairs, fronted silver and gold to merchant intermediaries who carried out the actual buying, selling, and lending, splitting the resulting profit. It was venture capital with a 13th century accent, and it turned plunder from a one-time windfall into ongoing working capital almost overnight. Picture the practical difference this made for a single caravan. Under the old system, 70 or 100 men, along with their camels, horses, and supplies, might set out from one end of the Silk Road and simply never arrive. Swallowed by bandits, a hostile border guard, or a toll collector who decided the whole shipment was the price of passage. Under the ortak system, several merchants pooled their capital so that no single failed caravan wiped anyone out, and the same imperial passport that protected an ambassador protected a shipment of silk. The risk of moving goods across a continent hadn't disappeared. It had simply been priced, spread out, and made survivable, which is a different thing entirely from making it safe. But here is the structural implication that Part 3 will grow into. The empire's entire economic model depended on continuous inflows, of tribute, of plunder, of trade revenue skimmed at the source, because the Mongols themselves produced almost nothing the settled world actually wanted. They were, at their core, a management layer sitting on top of other people's farms, other people's silk workshops, other people's silver mines. That model works beautifully as long as the territory under management keeps expanding, or at minimum keeps producing on schedule. It works far less beautifully once the expansion stops, and the bill for administering 4 continents' worth of territory comes due anyway. Removing the tolls was only half the equation. Running an empire this size costs money, and here is where the math gets uncomfortable. Let's run the actual numbers, because they are almost impossible to comprehend. The input cost came first, in the form of the yam, communicating across an empire that eventually stretched over roughly 24 million square kilometers, close to a quarter of the Earth's land surface, meant messages had to move faster than any single horse could carry them. The solution was a network of relay stations built every 20 to 40 miles along every major route. In China alone, the Mongols eventually operated more than 1,400 of these stations, each one stocked with fresh horses, food, and lodging. So a rider could hand off his message and let the next rider, on a fresh mount, cover the following stretch at full speed. Read that again. 1,400 stations, in one region of the empire alone, each one a standing government facility that had to be sited, built, staffed, and supplied before a single message ever passed through it. Then came the ongoing cost, and this is where the real surprise sits. Historians estimate the Chinese arm of the yam system alone required something on the order of 50,000 horses in continuous rotation, animals that had to be fed, rested, bred, and replaced, year after year, whether or not any message needed sending that particular week. Add the lodging, the grain stores, the station staff, and the local villages conscripted to keep it all running, and you have a permanent logistics network on the scale of a small country's entire transportation budget, operating every single day of the year regardless of demand. The postal system that made the empire governable was, on its own, one of the largest recurring expenses any state up to that point had ever taken on. Then came the hidden cost, and this is the one the standard account skips entirely. A large share of the empire's commercial expansion was financed through ortok loans, the same merchant partnerships that had looked so elegant in Part 1, in which Mongol princes and their households advanced silver to merchant agents, who then lent it onward at compounding interest. Unconstrained by the religious usury caps that limited lending rates in the Islamic and Christian worlds around them, some of these loans reportedly compounded at rates approaching 100% a year. When a good harvest or a successful caravan covered the debt, everyone profited handsomely. When it didn't, the debt rolled over and rolled over again, until ordinary households, the same people actually growing the wheat and weaving the silk that all this tax and tribute ultimately depended on, were sold into debt bondage, to cover interest their grandparents hadn't finished paying off. The great Khan Munka tried to rein this in during the 1250s, sending imperial investigators to audit the worst of the ortok abuses. The fact that a great Khan felt compelled to police his own financiers tells you how large that hidden layer had grown. Zoom out, and the pattern is stark. Stack the 3 layers together. The fixed cost of building the network, the recurring cost of feeding and staffing it every day of the year, and the compounding cost of debts most households never chose to take on. And the yam and ortok systems combined into something closer to a second government budget running quietly underneath the visible one. It was not a rounding error next to the glamour of conquest. In the regions it touched, it was arguably the single largest recurring claim on local resources the empire made, dwarfing what most individual military campaigns cost to fight in any given season. The empire remembered today for its horsemen was, underneath, held together by relay stations and loan ledgers. The numbers were working, right up until a single variable the Mongols could print, but could no longer back, buckled under its own weight. Here is the structural problem with the Mongol financial system that nobody in the 13th century fully solved. An empire this large, built on tribute and trade rather than domestic production, needed a single trusted medium of exchange to hold it together. And the medium the Mongols eventually chose was paper. Name the flaw precisely. The Yuan dynasty, the Mongol regime ruling China after Kublai Khan's conquest, introduced the world's first nationwide paper currency, backed by a silver reserve, known as the chow. For its first few decades, it worked remarkably well, genuinely one of the more sophisticated monetary innovations of the medieval world, centuries ahead of anything Europe would attempt. But a silver-backed currency only holds its value if the government resists the temptation to print more notes than it holds silver to redeem. and an empire constantly at war, against the southern Song, against Vietnam, against Japan, against its own restive provinces, sits under constant fiscal pressure to do exactly that. Trace the buildup. Through the stable middle decades of the dynasty, inflation stayed mild. By the 1320s, the cost of financing wars and an increasingly extravagant court had pushed successive emperors to issue far more chow than their silver reserves could ever redeem. By the 1330s, that overprinting had become chronic rather than occasional. By the 1350s, floods, famine, and open rebellion collided with a currency nobody fully trusted anymore, and the government's own paper money, the innovation that had made transcontinental commerce possible in the first place, was becoming worthless in the hands of the merchants who depended on it. The human dimension here matters. It wasn't the Mongol elite who bore this cost first. It was the households paying taxes in a currency that lost value between the morning they earned it and the evening they spent it. Grain merchants in cities like Hangzhou hoarding rice rather than sell it for depreciating notes. Silk tax households in the north who had been separately registered by the state specifically to guarantee its textile revenue, now watching that revenue shrink in real terms every season. When a currency stops holding value, the people with the least room to maneuver are always the ones who feel it first and feel it longest. Then came the crisis moment that made the abstraction impossible to ignore. In 1327, the Ilkhanate, the Mongol Khanate ruling Persia, nominally still bound to the Great Khan in China through a shared monetary and tributary framework, broke that bond. The Ilkhan Abu Sa'id began minting his own silver coinage, independent of any authority in Dadu, the Yuan capital. On paper, it was a minor administrative act. In practice, it was one Mongol Khanate publicly declaring that it no longer trusted or needed the financial union that had loosely held the four Khanates together since Genghis Khan's death a century earlier. Widen the lens, and the pattern comes into focus. Abu Sa'id's coinage wasn't an isolated act of Persian independence. It was the structural flaw finally becoming visible. An empire that had unified currency, tribute, and trade under one system had built no mechanism for what happens once the center's own money stops being trustworthy. Once one Khanate stopped trusting Dadu's paper, the rest of the empire's financial architecture had no real reason to hold together either. The bill had been deferred for decades. What came next wasn't a surprise. It was arithmetic. Start with the scale of consequence. Within roughly 4 decades of that first Ilkhanate coinage revolt, the Yuan dynasty, the wealthiest and most administratively sophisticated piece of the Mongol world, had collapsed entirely, and the population centers it once governed had absorbed a demographic loss that historians place in the tens of millions. The first consequence was structural. The currency system that had held the empire's commercial life together broke down region by region. As the Chow lost credibility, the Yam system, which depended on local stations being reliably resupplied and paid, began failing exactly where it mattered most, in the overstretched northern and western provinces furthest from the capital's direct reach. A courier network that had once moved messages across thousands of miles in days started fragmenting into unreliable, disconnected pieces. The second consequence followed directly from the first. With the fiscal and communication backbone weakening, the 4 Khanates that had once operated as one loosely federated economic zone, the Yuan in China, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Golden Horde in Russia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, drifted into fully separate, often mutually hostile states. Genghis Khan's descendants spent much of the 14th century fighting one another over succession, having spent the 13th century conquering everyone else. Beyond the balance sheets, the human accounting was severe. Chinese census records suggest that in some northern provinces, the registered population fell by well over half across the century of Mongol rule, a decline driven only partly by war and increasingly by famine, forced labor, and the collapsing value of the wages people were actually paid. The households who had spent generations as silk tax registrants, wheat farmers, and ortok debtors were, disproportionately, the ones absorbing the cost of a system built above their heads and never designed with their survival as the priority. The third consequence carried the longest tail of all. The very trade network the Mongols had built to move silk, silver, and grain across Eurasia also moved something else. Historians trace part of the transmission of the Black Death to those same overland and maritime routes the Pax Mongolica had knitted together, most infamously through the 1347 siege of the Genoese trading post at Kaffa, where a Mongol army is said to have catapulted plague-infected corpses over the walls before the disease traveled home with fleeing merchants. The structural damage outlasted the empire by generations. China's population, which may have stood near 120 million before the Mongol conquest, had fallen to something closer to 60 million by the time the dynasty collapsed in 1368, a decline driven by war, famine, and epidemic disease, moving along the very roads that had once been the empire's greatest economic achievement. What replaced the collapsed system was, in China at least, a hard reversal. In 1368, the rebel leader Zhu Yuanzhang drove the last Yuan emperor back onto the steppe and founded the Ming dynasty, a regime built explicitly against everything the Mongols had represented, suspicious of foreign merchants, cautious with paper money, protective of domestic production over cross-border commerce. The counterintuitive twist is that the Ming's caution wasn't obviously an improvement. It solved the yuan's inflation problem and its dependence on unstable foreign trade routes, but it also walked China away from exactly the kind of open, integrated commercial network that had made the 13th century such a remarkable economic experiment in the first place. So here is the honest ledger. Here is the honest ledger of the Mongol Empire. On the asset side, a genuinely unified transcontinental trade zone, the world's first nationwide paper currency backed by precious metal, a postal and logistics network more sophisticated than anything built before it, and a century of exchange between East and West that moved goods, ideas, and technology at a pace medieval Eurasia had never seen. On the liability side, an economic model that depended on perpetual conquest to feed a management class that produced little itself, a currency system with no real check on overissuance, and a human cost, in debt bondage, in famine, in disease, that fell hardest on the people the empire ruled, not the people who ran it. The Mongol Empire wasn't destroyed by exceptional villains or a uniquely reckless dynasty. It was produced by incentives. Expand or stagnate, print or default, extract or collapse. Each step was rational, given what the system rewarded at that moment. Each step quietly transferred the real cost onto whoever had the least power to refuse it. So the next time you watch an institution promise unlimited growth funded by unlimited credit, backed by a currency it controls but doesn't fully trust itself, you are not looking at something new. You are looking at something very, very old. The Mongols proved the concept 700 years ago. The only question left is who is holding the ledger when the bill finally comes due.